Hey guys, Tyler here from Turnaround Sports, and today we're going to talk about our lifting sessions and how you should approach them. A couple things to start. This is going to be a little bit of a longer presentation here. I am going to split it up into different presentations if you want to attack uh, them at different times. So just keep that in mind. I will link all of them in the description below. And without further ado, let's get started. So, big key with lifting here is no matter what phase you're in, you want quality movement. You don't want quantity. If you have quality, then you can start chasing the quantity, but you shouldn't chase quantity without quality. Big key here. Learning that proper technique and learning your limitations is going to help you so much more than lifting the heaviest weights possible without any general direction or focus. So what we're after the adaptations of the nervous system. I mean, that simply means the ability of the coordinated neuromuscular system to be activated from brain, plus the ability of the muscle to produce muscle tension from the command in your brain that drives everything in strength training. So if you can activate a lot of those muscle fibers, say you're doing a squat and you're only activating about 50% of those glute muscles through training, ideally what we're going to get hopefully 100% of those glute muscles activated every time we need them. But if not, if we move from 50, let's say, to 80% activation, that is going to get so many more gains than just chasing that. How much weight can I get with activating 50% of my glutes? So think, whenever you do this, proper technique and activation, and also that neuromuscular connection from your brain, nervous system to the muscles itself to activate, that's going to drive so many more gains and adaptations than simply just unloading amount of weights and just crushing the weights. So keep that in mind. Getting the desired results from strength training, we kind of talked about this a little bit already. Decreasing those energy leaks. That simply means the imbalances at joints, inability of a joint to move because muscles are shortened. To put that in a little bit of perspective, think a really tight IT band, and it's inhibiting the hip and knee function and stability when you're running or biking or whatever. Oftentimes this happens later in the season, and that can lead to injuries. A lot of times the injuries don't happen overnight. Typically, they happen over a period of time. So if you are actively keeping on top of these things, then you have a much better chance of not getting injured. Not to say that it's going to eliminate it 100%, but just keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking through this. Increasing the central nervous system abilities, strength and hypertrophy adaptations, the signals to get to the muscles, increase recruitment of that muscle. That's what we talked about on the last slide. Just the ability for your central nervous system to activate those muscles is going to drive so much adaptation and so much increase. Oftentimes, a lot of people look past that, and they shouldn't. So, improving our body awareness as well. The more you go through some of these weightlifting movements, and the more you do these kind of sessions, the better you're going to get at it, and the better you're going to become aware of how you should be moving through these things. Thinking in terms of long-term development before we dive into super specifics here. For swimming, I know this is a general overview, but I kind of broke these down into a couple different categories right here. In swimming, it's mainly derived from technique, strength, and pacing. Cycling, positioning, fueling, strength. I talked a little bit about position here, maintaining your position on the bike. That's definitely needed, and you need to think about that, but we'll cross that bridge in a little while. Running, pretty much targeted from technique and strength. So anytime you create your strength training program, you want to look at these things to start. Then you're going to look at what your athlete limitations are and kind of move from there. But if you just start off here, you're going to have a great gauge for things, and you're going to allow yourself to hit a couple of areas that most people miss. Equipment needed. Body weight bands, suspended trainers, think like TRX or the Jungle Gym, things like that. Kettlebells, deadlifts, barbells with plates. I put like different numbers in here. 1 to 5 is pretty much, I would call it essential or almost essential. Number 6, optional, barbells with plates if you have enough space, if you have enough funds to allow yourself to purchase those things. They can become very beneficial. If you don't want any of these, if you want to keep yourself kind of equipment free, you can join a gym, and this will have almost all of this here. Oftentimes the gyms will not have some of the bands, and you'll have to ask for those or get personal training to get those, so just keep that in mind. But a lot of the bands, they're really cheap online. They're not a huge dent in the wallet, so you can think about that as well. If you're a time-crunched athlete, you might want to think about the pretty much the first 5. It's going to be, it's not going to take up too much space in your place, and it's going to allow you to get a lot of quality sessions in without going to the gym and adding a whole lot of time to your training. Different movements here. The 6 main movements here: push, pull, squat, hinge, press, and rotary stability. Rotary stability is, think that anti-rotation core activated muscles, or exercises rather. But the push, you don't need a whole lot of time on that because you get a ton on the bike already. If we're talking about running, then you might have to add a little bit more in there. But 9 times out of 10, your athletes do not need a lot of this extra pushing movements right here. We will do those. You should do those exercises, but don't be totally married to the push exercises all the time. Yeah, that 300-pound bench press is super sexy, but is that really needed if you're swimming, biking, or running? Think about that. Is that really needed in your individual sport? And if it is, then let's do it. Let's go for it. But you always got to think about, what is my sport using? What do I need to maximize my benefits from this sport? And then go from there. The pull. These pull muscles are often very much neglected. It's because it's a little bit harder to get these exercises without the gym, without those cable machines, things like that. You can do it for sure. It's just a little more challenging. You have to get a little more creative if you're doing things at home. And this creativity, if anyone's been through a year-long training cycle, they know about 10, 20 weeks before their main event, they start to get a little crabby. The training time starts to increase significantly, and life stretch kind of gets in the way as well. And these pull exercises are usually the first thing to go from your exercise routine. And I caution you, because these pull exercises oftentimes need to be a staple of your exercise routine. So keep those in mind. You need these. They're a prime mover on the swim, a stabilizer, or a sling on the run. So again, super critical right there. And it's important to balance these out. Think back to the push, got to balance it out with the pull. All right. And inversely a little bit as well. Squat, very similar to cycling and running. Hinge, this is another critical movement. I would argue, no matter what athlete you are. It's very difficult, but essential. And that's because it involves a lot of different muscles, a lot of different coordinated movements to actually do the hinge movement. And if you don't have this, it's going to be a problem for you later on in the season. I can almost guarantee it. Okay. Main stages of lifting: anatomical adaptation, where you're learning the motions, learning the movements; hypertrophy, where you're building muscle; max strength, you're developing strength and movement patterns; transfer to sport, developing speed, power, and agility; maintenance, you're developing strength endurance for movement abilities and patterns. You can argue there's a little bit more, or maybe too many up here, depending on what you're doing. But these are pretty much the 5 here. So that maintenance one, that's pretty much when you're maintaining your strength over the course of your competition cycle. Those 8 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever you're doing. First one up, anatomical adaptation. Your foundation, decreasing the risk of injury. This is typically going to last 6 to 10 weeks. If you're a little bit more on the novice side, you could bump that up even 4 more weeks right here. There's no problem in staying in this anatomical adaptation phase for a little longer if you are a beginner. And if you're not, then obviously you don't need to spend too much time in here. You don't need to spend the 16, 12 weeks in here, but you'd still need to spend time in here every single year after you're coming off of that transition phase or that just detraining zone in your training here. There's going to be little or no weight in here. Typically the sets are going to be 2 to 3, and they're going to be reps of 8 to 15. So notice that 8 to 15 reps is in line with the hypertrophy phase, and as you will increase your time in this phase, or as the weeks go by, you're going to start to increase that weight and move up to the hypertrophy level, but you're not quite going to get there because this is the anatomical adaptation stage. And in here, you're pretty much going to learn how your body moves around. You're going to learn the proper movements. You're going to learn the proper technique, focused on multi-jointed movements and addressing imbalances big time. RPE should be about 5 to 6. Again, there's really no heavy weights in here, and the techniques are pretty much driving the focus of this one. And after you nail the techniques, then you can start to increase the weight a little bit as the weeks, months go by. But just keep in mind, technique is super important on here. And this phase is going to increase the strength of your connective tissue, stability in joints, and bone strength and density. Because of those last three, that's the main reasons why you shouldn't rush through this phase. If you do rush through this phase, you're going to set yourself up for failure later on, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Second phase is your hypertrophy phase. This is after your anatomical phase only. A lot of people rush into this, and a lot of training plans and coaches stick with this phase of training pretty much all year round. A couple of problems with that, but we'll talk about that in a second. This phase, again, you're lasting 6 to 12 weeks, and that range, there's a range in there because it's dependent on you as an athlete, or what you are trying to accomplish. If this is your first time lifting and this is your first time getting to the hypertrophy phase after this anatomical adaptation, you might spend a little more time in here just because the weights are going to be a little bit lower. You're going to need a little more time with that technique. You're going to probably have a little more fatigue. So you might want to stretch this out over a couple additional weeks. But again, this is individual to you as an athlete and your goals, importantly. So make sure you plan it out like that. RPE is increasing a little bit. You might have an 8 here, but very rarely. I mean, we're not really focused on getting super strong here yet. We're just focused on increasing a little bit. Okay. Sets are about 3 to 4, 8 to 15. Again, that rep range is the same as the phase before. Typically, you're going to be here about 2 to 3 weeks, 60-minute sessions. Your training time in this phase, it's starting to increase. They're starting to get a little more challenging in the other sports or sport that you are really focused on. So that's why your session time or duration is starting to come down a little bit here. The main focus here is to increase the ability of the muscle to contract. So if you rush into here, this is going to be the thing that you get hurt the most by. Because if you do that anatomical adaptation phase first, what's going to happen is that's going to increase on its own. So when you get here, you can actually use those increased muscle fibers that you are recruiting to gain the strength right there. If you come into here first, again, say you're only activating 50% of that muscle, the muscle fibers, you're only going to be training those 50% of the muscle fibers because the other half aren't activating. But if you go through that anatomical adaptation and then arrive here, then you have a much better chance to activate more and thus get stronger easier. Technique becomes the huge limiting factor in this phase, and you're going to be a little sore here. Sorry, I misspelled that here. You're going to be a little bit sore, but it shouldn't hamper you from really hitting your main training workouts. And if it does, then you need to reevaluate your training targets. So if you targeted 4 sets, then maybe you need to back it down to 3 sets so you can hit those other ones and not be super crushed coming out of the gym here. Because if you are, then you're taking away from your main focus that you are training, and we do not want to do that. Focused on multi-jointed movements and refining balance at the joints here. So there is going to be, fewer exercises a little bit, just because of the amount of time needed to recover between the sets. And you're pushing your development toward that max strength side of the recovery, but not quite yet because we're not in that phase. So as the weeks go by, you want to slowly change up that rest in between the sets and move it towards the max strength side of things. But do not start out there because, again, if you rush into that next phase, the max strength phase, spoiler, then you are rushing the progression of you, and you are rushing the progression of this phase, and you're not going to get the most out of this in your max strength side of things, and that's going to really hamper your development for sure. And again, It's really easy to stick in this phase throughout the year, or just fall into some bad habits and just bang it out, and just, you know what, I'm done with this set, I'm done with everything, and I'm just going to go to the next set. I'm just going to go to the next set of exercises. And if you do that, you're changing the focus of the workout into more of a cutting session rather than a hypertrophy session. So again, just keep that in mind. A lot of people really don't do this phase right, so be careful here. The third one is the max strength. Again, 6 to 12 weeks, the range is there because you as an individual need to identify how long you need to stay there. 2 to 4 months here. This is the second main focus of any strength training program, and again, you should not go here unless you've done the anatomical adaptation and then the hypertrophy and then arrived here. In this phase, you're going to increase the ability of muscles to produce max recruitment of that muscle, focused on multi-jointed movements again and creating balance at movements at the joints again. So you can see a lot of this is the same, but what we're doing is increasing that muscle fiber recruitment for that muscle, and that's going to be the key here. Next up is the explosiveness and nature of this phase. It's going to be heavy, about 85% of your estimated 1 to 3 rep max. We're going to learn how to work on technique under duress. That right there, that sentence is key for this phase. The weights are heavy here, maybe the heaviest over the whole course of your phase, possibly, and the explosiveness here is going to really allow you to translate that into making big gains into your training. A lot of athletes find that they get a lot of big training bumps after going through this phase because they're doing things in the weight room that they've never done before, and they're translating those adaptations, if done right, into their workouts, which is the main goal here. We're going to have 1 to 2 movements. You know that you need to improve in the max strength phase. What I mean by that is, say you really struggle with a hinge. If that's the case, we'll be doing hinge movements in the anatomical adaptation, the hypertrophy phase, and then we're going to be doing that in the max strength phase as well. And you shouldn't arrive at this max strength phase not having increased weights over your troubled areas, the movements that you have a lot of trouble with. And if you do, then do not just rush in here. Okay, 85% of my 1 rep max, I'm going to work on this deadlift right here. I'm really going to crush it. Do not do that. Because if you haven't built up the adaptation and if you haven't built up the tolerance to those weights, you're going to put yourself into a lot of positions that are not going to be conducive for success or allow you to get out of the weight room without injury. And that's another big key here. So do not rush into this, but you do need to focus on some of your movements to improve your max strength that are weak for you. Make sure you're doing that in your anatomical adaptation phase, then your hypertrophy, then you come out here. RPE 6 to 7, again, maybe 8 here, but again, we've already done a lot of this other stuff in those other 2 phases, so it's not going to be super hard for you here if you've been set up correctly. If you're a beginner, you might only need to start out at 60 to 65% of that estimated 1 to 3 rep max for you. Just because this is going to be the first time you've gone here, chances are if this is the first time you've gone through a serious weight program, then you probably have never gone over here, or maybe you've only been hanging out at this area, this 80-85% area when you go in the gym, and now when you get here, you're going to have proper form, you're going to have proper technique, and that's going to allow you to have a lot of those gains. Changing the moves every 6 to 8 weeks here. Again, if you're going through a 12-week cycle in this max strength, you can change the exercises 2-3 times. If you are more advanced, then you're going to need to change those exercises up more, not only to create the proper stimulation to increase that strength, but also for a mental reprieve from this strength training. Goals here is to increase max strength. For sure, that's going to be the big focus of this if you haven't figured it out already. Typically, athletes develop a lot of overuse injuries from not completing this phase. Think back to the hypertrophy one before, where a lot of athletes get stuck into that phase, they get stuck into their routine, they start to limit the rest, and that's where bad things happen over there. And then the overuse injuries come from the poor alignment, the joint alignment, and imbalance at the joint. So Going back to the third point up here, learn how to work on technique under duress. That is super key during this phase. And again, if you don't do that, you're setting yourself up for failure later on. Conversion to sport-specific strength. Depending on your schedule and your availability, your training cycle and all that, your races, how frequently you're doing that. Typically, this phase lasts anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, 2 to 3 sets, 3 to 8 reps. If you need strength and if you need endurance, you're doing 2 to 3 sets again, but you're increasing those reps. Obviously, the percentages of those reps of that 1 to 3 rep max is going to vary if you're doing strength or endurance. But ideally, you want to be in the gym about 2 to 3 times a week. And if you can't do that, then you need to stack these on top of your swimming, biking, running, whatever you have the most time available to you. That's not going to take you well out of your way and create a whole nother session if you don't have that time. In this area, a lot of athletes kind of nix the gym, nix these movements right here, and I stress that this needs to be a key portion of your training plan over the course of this different phase right here, because if you just let everything lapse, you're going to have a great sport-specific phase in your training, and that's going to leave you up for a little bit of failure during your racing just because you let this go a little bit. So if you don't have that time, you still need to focus on your things. Think like 2 to 3 times a week. Day 1 and 3, focus on your biggest weak points. And day 3, it can be a strength and balancing work, working on range of motion, especially in the thoracic or hip extension area. Oftentimes that's a big struggle spot for a lot of people. So just adding these in when you can, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be a giant session each time. It doesn't have to be a 60-minute session. Ideally it would, but if you don't have that time, then maybe you put it after a different workout. A swim, bike, or run, wherever you have the most availability. Swim at a gym, then you just do your strength moves, your strength training immediately after that. Then tips and tricks like that are going to help you keep this up over a longer period of time and increase your chances of having a great race day for you. Again, these are going to be short, highly targeted sessions. Multi-jointed movements. Is that starting to come into your head? And am I starting to sound like a broken record here? Multi-jointed movements, building resilient balance at the joint. Teaching proper dynamic warm-ups that open up muscles and movements and shorten ranges of motion after closed-off sports. Again, swim, bike. Stack it onto those workouts. Allow yourself to just get 20 more minutes after the bike. If you're doing an extra bike, 20 more minutes, waking up 20 more minutes earlier, or going into work 20 minutes later. It's not that much, but it will help so much later on. Ideally, you're doing 2 or 3 movement sessions in addition to this. This is think like foam rolling. We're including some bands, maybe a couple kettlebells in there as well. That's going to be right here as well. TV time, rolling during TV time, big help right there. This is typically where you're going to see some of the overgearing efforts on the bike. They don't take the place of strength training because you can't really take the place of strength training. You can simulate it, but it doesn't have the same effect. Again, some of the different areas, some of the different sports that you're going to see different workouts in here. You're going to see on the bike, you're going to see power stomps, attack repeats, big ring endurance rides. You're going to see low cadence tempos, your low cadence targets here and there, power starts, and it all depends on what your main goal is. Swim, you're going to see more paddles, surges, breath control, only to some extent in there. Run, you're going to see bounds, hill repeats, sprinter starts, ankle poppers, all kinds of cool stuff in there. This is typically the most fun area of the training time. And when we get out of this phase, a lot of athletes really struggle with starting to hit the other areas just because this one is I call this the fun phase. And then we got to get down to business later on. But this is the fun phase. And a lot of people here, just like the hypertrophy phase, get stuck in these areas. And it's important to kind of come out and start to change your focus a little bit more depending on what your race is or where it is or the environment conditions, etc. And kind of move on to the other areas. But this is going to be where you're starting to set yourself up for success for your individual race or races. Last one is, or second to last one, is the power. Typically, we aren't doing a whole lot of this. It's really risky to really focus on power. We will add some power, but it's not going to be a whole power phase. Just because we're already doing a ton of training outside of the weight room, you don't want to crush a power phase because that's going to open yourself up to a lot of injuries and create a whole lot of unnecessary strain. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this. Again, we will do some, but it's not going to be a full-on power session. So maintenance phase, 6 to 12 weeks. Again, know yourself. For triathletes, highly individual people, this is really only going to last 4 to 8 weeks. It's not going to last a whole lot of time. It's not going to drag on. And if you find yourself in the maintenance phase for 10, 15 weeks, then you're really going to see some decline in performance. You're not going to be able to replicate some of those efforts that you experience at the beginning of this phase, maybe even middle, that you will towards the end. RPE is 6 to 8. They're going to be short sessions, about 40 minutes, 2 sets of 5 to 12 reps, 3 times a week. The reps kind of fall into the hypertrophy, but we're doing less sets. Think that less time right there. There's fewer exercises, more focus on that multi-jointed movements, and your biggest weak points. Again, super critical that you focus on those big weak points and you don't shy away from them. Yeah, we will do sessions and fun things that focus on your strengths, but by far the most important thing is identifying those weak points and fixing those or tightening up the leaks that are associated with those movements. This is typically during the high ride or run or swim, high TSS area of the year. And a lot of times athletes are too tired to complete a lot of these main workouts. That's why we split them up into shorter sessions, and you can, again, stack these on top of other workouts. And if you're too tired, you can shrink the amount of sets, but you really want to focus on those 5-6 main movements that we talked about before. You want to maintain the strength that you've gained up to this point. Again, at this point, it could be 36 weeks into this training cycle, maybe more, depending on who you are and where you have gone throughout this phase. But you really want to maintain that training that you've done over the course of the year, and you don't want it to decrease. Excuse me. If you have a little more time here, more ability to train 2 times a week after you bike, and 1 additional standalone session. So you can do that additional 10 to 15 minute session after a swim, bike, run, whatever you're doing. It doesn't have to be just a bike. And then 1 additional standalone session of about 35 to 40 minutes, moderately to heavy, but you want to be very focused on what you're doing. Oftentimes, we don't even add a specific target for your weights. Right here, we do RPE. It's just easier. It's a little bit quicker. A lot of times we're not in the gym, so we can't really hit it. If you are in a gym, we will give you specifics, but in example session, you're going to work on your dynamic movements, soft tissue area, dynamic warm-up, and then 2, 3, if you have enough time, maybe even 4 pairs of exercises, and then after that, you're done. That's it. Super simple in this phase. Again, you gotta continue this phase if you want to keep seeing the gains out of the weight room, on the road, in the pool, in the open water, wherever you're doing the bulk of your training and your race is targeted. You really want to keep this up to keep those gains going through the season. A lot of times, people who don't, they will stop their progressions pretty much right around the beginning of summertime, and they'll maintain for all of summer into fall. And this is a great way to avoid that. You don't want to do that. An example here, 4 times a week, either before or after a session. So if you're a weak swimmer, 15-minute sessions of a set of 5 exercises that counteract what they just did in the water. Again, this is just an example for a swimmer who has a lot of imbalances, a lot of weaknesses in the swim. The reason that they have chose to focus on the the movements that counteract the muscles from the swim, is they're trying to develop better in the swim because that's their limiter, that's their weakness. Going to be about 70 to 80% of your estimated 3-rep max. Again, this kind of falls into the hypertrophy phase, but not quite, because we're just maintaining here. And again, the volume is much more important here. You're going to see a lot more TRX, kettlebells, bands, bodyweight exercises, but the bodyweight exercises are going to be a little different because we're going to activate all the muscles associated with things like, say, a push-up. You're going to activate the lats, the glutes, the hamstring, the quads, all those muscles that you can possibly engage, and then we're going to do a push-up. So it's going to be a much different bodyweight exercise than you're used to. Right here, this is just the different phases, and we kind of break them down into a little example strength training gear for you: anatomical adaptation, hypertrophy blend with max strength, conversion to sport, and maintenance. If you have added these up, this is way more than 52 weeks, and that is because you have to focus on who you are as an athlete and what you want or where you want to go from your strength training program. If you are someone new to strength training, you're going to spend a little more time in anatomical adaptation. You're probably going to take out that hypertrophy blend, probably going to shrink down the conversion to sport a little bit, and that maintenance stage just a little bit as well, just because you want to spend more time in that getting to know you kind of time, getting to know how your body moves and functions properly, and identifying those technique needs for you. And if you are someone who's been no stranger to the weight room, you don't need a whole lot of time in this anatomical adaptation stage. You're probably going to cut that in half. Hypertrophy, you're probably going to cut that in half as well. You're going to do this blend with max strength a little bit better than most. You're going to spend some time at that max strength. And then depending on what your main focuses are, you can do those last two. But again, you have to really identify yourself as an athlete, what your experience is, and what you want from that strength training in order to have a hyper-focused layout for you. Metabolic training, you can do this if you're really short on time, but you have to go through those first 3 stages, that anatomical, hypertrophy, and max strength. If you do not, it's going to be a waste. So avoid this unless you've done the proper buildup. The transition phase, the base phase, this is a great time to really focus on those first 3 and then move into this phase as well, or move into this phase if you are one of these people who's really short on time, just because the amount of training is going to increase, right, from the your main sessions. And ideally, these lifting sessions will have to decrease to take the place, because if you only have 10 hours a week total to train, then you only have 10 hours, and we can't change that. The only thing we can change is the amount of time you're actually doing a workout session versus a lifting session, and the proper progression from there. Those are the only really 2 things that we can change. So we talked about that already. This is a couple cool different slides here, programming for different distances. Sprint and Olympic distance, they require a lot of speed and power, and that's based off of your max strength. What you're going to need here is great power positions, because posture is key in order to develop that power. You're going to be needing to work on some more breath control things, think swimming, breathe 3 times on the way down, breathe every 15 strokes, those kind of things, just because you're going to be working a lot closer to lactate threshold. And again, if you only have 10 hours to train, then we can only go to those 10 hours. After that, we have to manipulate what we're doing outside of that. Speed and power, they are really, really important during these distances, but it shouldn't be your sole focus here. Again, you can't only focus on speed and power because the other areas are going to get affected by that, and you don't want to solely focus on speed and power, because again, it's very similar to if you only stay in that hypertrophy phase of training. You can only do so much work there before you get a breakdown, before the quality of things breaks down. So that is super key here. You will do a lot, but you cannot do it every time. Half iron distance, that's 70.3. Speed, endurance is much more important here. You're going to have a little bit lower powers. This is kind of the crossover area, because you're going to have lower powers for longer periods, but you're kind of right on the edge of that max strength and power that you were before, but also endurance. So it's a little game here for this half iron distance. Postural endurance becomes a little bit more important because you're holding those positions for longer periods of time. A lot more technique starts to come into play here, just because the chances of a breakdown is going to have much more impact over the amount of a half Ironman versus a sprint and then Olympic and then a half iron. You could kind of get away with some of those postural imbalances of a sprint just because the amount of time isn't long. But take that same athlete and move them to a half iron distance, then they start to struggle if those postural techniques or endurance isn't up to par, just because they break down, and some of those leaks, they start to magnify themselves over the amount of that race. So say they're losing 5 seconds a mile on their run. Yeah, that might not affect them on the sprint, but 5 seconds a mile over the course of that half iron distance is going to add up big time, and it might even lead to more later on, depending on how they can go. Pushing from the Olympic to half distance isn't that tough because you already have, hopefully, the power and speed built into your body, your system, and your training plan. It becomes a little bit harder to do the inverse of that because you don't have that speed and power coming from the half or full side, and it's a lot more difficult to obtain that strength, power, speed after you've done a lot of full distance, half distance, just because the demands are very different. So you essentially have to retrain yourself again, and a lot of times this takes a couple of years to do, if not more. And a lot of times you see the athletes go from being specialists in the sprint and they move up to the Olympic distance. Then after a couple years from there, they move to the half, and then they move to the full. It's very rare that you'll see a full distance athlete move from the half to the Olympic to the sprint and have that increased success. So I know it's a super popular thing to do, to go ahead and chase that full, and that's great. But if you do that for years and years and years and years, and then you say, okay, I want to have the same success that I have at the half iron or iron distance at the sprint or Olympic distance, it's probably not going to come right out of the gate. Okay. And when you do make that switch from the half or full to that sprint or Olympic, it's going to take a couple of years. And if you stick with it for those couple of years and then decide, okay, I want to go to that full again, you're going to have to change again. It's going to come back a little bit easier, but you're going to have to work on some of those endurance and postural endurance areas for those longer distances, just because you were hyper-focused on the sprint and Olympic, and that, again, super focused on the power and speed. A little bit of a tangent there, but just keep that in mind when you're going from flip-flopping from distance to distance to distance. If you're going half iron or iron distance every year and you're really crushing it, and then next year you go to an Olympic, and then the next year you go to a full, and you keep flip-flopping and flip-flopping, you might want to think about targeting one distance and then changing from there. So just keeping that in mind. Full distance, again, this is the ultimate strength endurance event. Okay, you're going to have probably your lowest powers over the course of these 5 different events. Postural endurance is key, and durability against injury is also key. Again, a lot of athletes, they focus on that half iron distance, and they have a lot of great success. And then they move over to the full distance, and it's okay to target a full distance 1 year, and say you get a couple of injuries that prevent you from doing that full, or it becomes not a good idea to chase that full anymore. It's not a bad idea to pivot back to that half, but just trying to chase that full target, even though you're not going to do it, or even say, okay, I know I really want to do a full. I'm going to really focus on that in 2 years. And the first year here, I'm going to increase my training. I'm going to still only race 70.3s, but I'm going to start to increase my training to a point of a full distance training load. And what that's going to do is going to allow your body to get that durability, which is arguably the most important thing in triathlon, long distance endurance, anything. Okay. And forcing your body to do that full on that first year, you could get away with it, but I would argue that it would be much more beneficial to you to have an increased training load than you did in previous years. Maybe you do a 3/4 to that full, right? And then the next year you go, your body isn't totally hit out of the blue from this increased training load. A lot of times you see this from the professional riders. They're crushing the U23, U25 circuits, then they go become a professional, and they really don't do anything for that first year. That second year, they then explode. And you see a lot of great results, but that first transition year, a lot of times their directors, they're really, they want their athletes to succeed, but they know that in-between year is so critical to an athlete's development. And if you rush that, and if you go from 1 year racing 70.3s, and the next year you're racing fulls, 2 or 3 of them, you're going to hamper your ability to recover. You're going to also hamper your development as an athlete. And I highly, highly recommend having a gap here in between the two, just to allow you the ability to gain that durability. So your session skeleton, this is essentially what you should expect from one of our training sessions. A soft tissue work, 3 to 5, 10 minutes max, foam rolling, that's it. Okay, that is it. You want to incorporate a couple breathing or posture exercises. Typically we do 1 to 2 dynamic warm-up exercises. You're going to have 3 to 7 of those. I don't think you're ever going to have less than 4, less than 5. But you probably will usually have 6 to 7 exercises that are going to address your major issues. And that's going to be key here, because the lifts are going to focus on your weaknesses, your weak spots, your leak points, right? And we're going to throw in some of these exercises that allow the muscles around this weakness to start to get active here. That's going to set you up for success, because the strength program comes next, and the first couple exercises, you're going to have the most explosive exercises. Think like power, jumping, and then we're going to start to move into some strength and correctives. And the last couple, we're going to have a postural challenge that's going to have rotary stability built into it. So think like a bird dog. Think a banded plank, where you're going to take that band and pull out to the side and fight that rotation from the hips and shoulders, stabilization of the shoulder during planks, things like that. That's what you're going to see there. That, in a nutshell, is the whole session. But let's dive into it a little bit more, and let's see what we got. All right, rolling areas. Typically, the areas to include the front of the shins, the quads, the hams, the glutes, chest, lats, upper back, thoracic extension on that foam roller. Front of the shins, this is a good one for the runners, cyclists as well. You want to go on the area that's not the bone. Again, we never roll joints or bones. We only roll muscles. And you can do the in between your shin and your calf as well. You're gonna have tight calves. But these are just the typically the most popular ones right here. Not to say that you can never roll your foot, you can never roll your calf. But again, this is a great starting spot for your rolling. There's a little bit of a difference between foam rolling for a warm-up and foam rolling for a recovery. For a warm-up, it's not going to be super long. You're going to spend 30 seconds on each location, 4 to 6 locations, again, backing up to here. All right, 4 to 6 locations. The goal is to kind of loosen you up a little bit, increase that blood flow, increase the muscle resting length, and trigger that sympathetic nervous system and get you ready to go for your session. Foam rolling for recovery, it's going to be a little bit longer. Think about a minute per location, 5 to, I would argue, up to 20 locations, depending on when you put that movement session in there. Typically 5 to 10 locations. What you're doing is restoring that muscle length, increasing the blood flow to that area, removing waste, triggering the parasympathetic nervous system in here. You do want to do this. You don't want to do it too much. Think like going to a massage and you come out and you just feel super loose and ready to go. Know when to put your recovery sessions in here. My favorite times to do these recovery sessions are after a long run. So I'll do my long run in the morning, and then at nighttime, I'll do one of these sessions while I'm watching TV, while I'm listening to a podcast, anything like that. And that really allows my body to recover. And I know that I won't be doing another high impact sport the next day. And it's going to allow me to recover without opening myself up to a lot of injuries that can happen after that. Next up is our breath work. You're going to have 1 to 2 exercises over here. These should only take you about 10, maybe 15 seconds. Okay. You're going to do a 2 to 4 second hold at that max point, 4 to 6 seconds full exhale through your mouth and from the bottom of your stomach up. Super important that you push out that air from the bottom of your stomach, really working that diaphragm in there. Some of these examples include crocodile breathing, sphinx breathing. There's a number of different ones you can do. These are the most popular ones. Third step is our dynamic movement. We're going to address your major imbalances. 4 to 7 exercises. We're only going to change these typically every couple of months here because we really are going to set up a plan that's important for you and focused on your weaknesses and phase goals. If you really are doing an upper body and lower body focused lifting session, you're going to need an upper body and a lower body dynamic warm-up just to set yourself up for success so you don't injure yourself. These are going to be moves that you struggle with. We're going to start off with 1 to 2 sets of 3 to 5 reps of each different one. As you gain better strength, we're going to move this up into 1 rep of 8, 12, 15 repetitions here. And again, this is not happening overnight. This is a progression. It's not happening over the course of 1 week, 2 weeks. We are building you up consistently and not allowing you to get injured through this massive jump. Okay. After you're done with your dynamic warm-up, you should have a little bit of a sweat going. Sometimes we are out of breath a little bit, or we feel like we need a little bit of a recovery. And if you don't arrive at the end of this dynamic warm-up feeling this way, then you need to do it again, or you need to change up your session or change up your targeted movements. Because if you're not, then you can't go cold into lifting right away, and that's wasting time. It's wasting valuable time that we do not have. And it's also not warming your muscles up to allow them to get the most out of your session, which is what we want. We don't want you doing sessions for no good reason. There should be an order to this. Typically, the first 2 are going to be short, and they're going to be slow. Think like ballerinas, side lunges, karaokes, figure 8 drills. The next exercises, exercise 3 and 4, they're going to be related to creating proximal stiffness to produce distal motion. Beginners, think like bird dog. We're going to do shielded breathing. We're going to do a side laying, straight leg lift, clamshells, half clamshells, black burns, incline bench, Y's, prone glute activation. In the intermediate or advanced, we're going to take these exercises and just go to level 2, level 3, make them a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder. Obviously, do not start out super hard. The first one, you want to start out medium and then build yourself up through this dynamic warm-up. Exercise 5 and 6 are going to be low-level plyometrics. You can even incorporate different exercises in here that are going to allow you to increase some of that training volume in the movements that we're doing for that day. So think like low-level plyometrics, jump rope, light bounding, skipping, light focal movements, like a light goblet squat for technique, looking what you need to identify when you're doing your movements, single leg kettlebell deadlifts. If you're doing an upper body focused workout, think your wall scap slides or wall angels, wall spinal stabilization, all kinds of cool things here. Typically 3 to 15 reps, 2 to 4 days a week for these ones. Just another quick slide on the dynamic warm-up. It's only going to last 8 to 12 minutes, 10 minutes. You're going to start general, then you're going to get gross, then you're going to start to get specific, you're going to hit your targeted areas, and then you're going to start to move into exercises that are going to be important for your program that day. then you're going to end on full body coordination movements. Super important that you go through this, just because you don't want to do the inverse and open yourself up to a little injury right after that rolling and breath work. So start off slow, easy, and then move and change into what you will be doing that day. Structuring of the main sets of the workout. So you're going to group 2 or 3 exercises together. A1, A2, maybe A3, depending on who you are and where you are in your phase or where you are in your training. You're going to do A1. If this is the first one, you're going to do a plyo or explosive movement done first. Then you're going to do a corrective or balance exercise immediately after that. If there is no A3, then just move right back into A1, A2, A1, A2, A1, A2. Then you're going to rest and recover based off of the guidelines and what phase you are in. Then you're going to repeat for B, D, or B, C, and possibly D if there is a D. Make sure you check your workouts. Again, you're going to move quickly from one exercise then the next, and then you're going to rest afterwards. That's the big key here, resting afterwards. So one, and you're going to get some rest at that second or third exercise, because the first one's going to be the main one. The second exercise in your set is going to be a corrective, postural, whatever, balance exercise. And then you're going to get recovery doing that, and then you're going to move back into A1 or B1, C1, D1. Rest periods, 90 seconds or less, are going to push your training to be more metabolic in nature. Think back a couple slides ago, we talked about that. 2 to 4 minutes, it's going to put you into the more hypertrophy and max strength. Think back to the hypertrophy. There was a bullet on that slide that said move towards the max strength side of things. And the 3 to 7 minutes, push your training more towards the neurological changes. That's what we're talking about. So maybe you only rest for 2 minutes at the very beginning of that hypertrophy phase, and you move out to that 4 minutes in between sets, pushing towards that max strength side of things as you get later in your hypertrophy phase, just so there's not a big shock of how you're supposed to do things later on in that max strength sessions. Okay, so this is just a breakdown of, imagine power is the A set of exercises. Power, plyometric, or exercises movements done first, but you have to have ample rest in between these if they are exclusively power, because if they're not, then you're going to open yourself up to injuries or just excessive wear and tear and breakdown on you. For these ones, for beginners, you're definitely going to have lighter weights for sure. If we are doing an explosive or speed component to these, the percentages of our 1 rep max, they're going to be way down. So just keep that in mind. The next B exercises, set of exercises, they're going to be the major movements that need work or the goal of that phase for you. C and possibly B as well. These are going to be the fundamental 5 over here, even though there's 6. The fundamental 6, you're going to pair these. If you pair these with an explosive strength move, you're going to need a short break to stimulate that, to get that nervous system ready to get excited. If you pair these with a static exercise, what that essentially is doing is that's teaching your muscles on the opposite side of the joint to relax during that movement. Again, a lot going on here, but know yourself as an athlete. Know what you need to progress on, know what your limitations are, and lastly, know where you are in your training cycle. Do not go to very explosive, very high-end power if you haven't done that hypertrophy, anatomical adaptation, hypertrophy, and then max strength, okay? Do not do that. Know where you are, know where you've been, and know what you need to work on as an individual. The last part of your main session is going to have a rotary stability component. We talked about some of these earlier. Think a bird dog, things like that. Think a plank where you take a band and you pull, or a dumbbell, something like that, and you're doing you're pulling that dumbbell through underneath you back into that plank without rotating or unstabilizing yourself in through that movement. That's going to allow you a lot of benefits. Think especially on the swim and the run right there. So that's going to help a ton with your body awareness and body balance. Tempo, you can play around with tempo if you are a more advanced lifter. Typically, if you're just starting out, what it's going to turn into is a 2-0-1-0. We'll talk about some of these in a second, but let's go back up to the first one, the 3-1-3-1. There's 4 numbers here. The first number is the amount of time it takes you to go from a starting position to the middle position. So for instance, let's say we're doing a squat. This 3 is the amount of time it takes you to go from standing to the bottom of your squat. That next number, the 1, is how much time you hang out at that bottom position. The third number, in this case it's a 3, is the amount of time it's going to take you to go from that bottom position back up to standing in that squat. And that last number is how much time you're going to hang out at that starting position. So there's 4 numbers here that you need to know. There's 4 different ones we'll talk about. The first one is this 3-1-3-1 tempo. This is for learning the movement control, core control, prepare the body for heavier, more explosive training. It's a great place to start your training cycles in the fall and the winter. It's also a good spot for you to come back to during your mid-season strength for people who travel a lot, because we're going to be doing bands, we're going to be doing dumbbells, things like that. Next one up is a 2-1-1-1. This is for your speed and power development. You're going to do this in the early and late base period as well throughout the riding and racing season, as it allows to train power and explosiveness. So when you do this, just keep in mind that your power and explosiveness, the weight shouldn't be super heavy. That's why it's a 2-1-1-1. Okay. Next one is starting strength and power. It's a 2-5-1-1. So a 5, a huge hold at the bottom of that position. Used for starting strength for intermediate advanced athletes, hang cleans, hands on hips, jumps from the bottom, things like that. There's a high risk of injury, which is why we only use about 30% of our 1 rep max here, just because of that 5-second hold down there. So just keep that in mind here. Self-paced tempo, if you're one of those people who say, you know what, I'm not really going to focus on that. This is my first time through the whole routine. I just want to do it on my own. Typically what a self-paced tempo turns into is a 2-0-1-0, and there's nothing wrong with this. The most important thing is that you don't rush it and really focus on your technique. If you do rush it, then bad things are going to happen here. So just keep that in mind with a self-paced tempo. Explosiveness, powers, jumps. We're going to use submaximal loads that allow you to move fast and well. Big word right there, well. Really focus on that technique here. There's different types. You can do body weight, weighted exercise, Olympic lifts. If you are doing the Olympic lifts, keep in mind that you don't have to do these Olympic lifts from the ground. You can stack these up onto different platforms. And what that does is that decreases the risk of injury for you. So just keep that in mind. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do here. Strength and correctives, think your B, C exercise or sets of exercises here. There's going to be less power here, but it's going to be more focused on your needs and imbalances. Typically, you're going to see a lot of squats, exercises that involve coordination and stability. And you're going to pair this with correctives that allow for better range of motion and control. So think say we're doing a lat pull down. Right, so you're going to do your lat pull down, and then afterwards we'll have you roll on your chest. Okay, we'll do some releasing of the chest. Again, it's not going to be super long because we're not rolling for recovery. We're rolling during our session, so it's only going to be about 30 seconds in there. After those 30 seconds, we're going to have you go right back to that lat pull down, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow these chest muscles to kind of relax a little bit and allow better range of motion, so you can get into a better power position for your lat pull down and hopefully engage more muscle fibers. Last part, usually the D set. This is the postural challenges and rotary stability. We put these at the end of the session because we want to challenge your core stability. A lot of programs do the inverse of this and put this at the beginning, but I would argue that it needs to go at the end, just because a lot of times we need this postural and rotary stability at the end of our events right here. These aren't going to be super heavy weighted, if at all. So what that does is that allows us to just stabilize and actively keep everything together for the duration of our session. And that translates really well out of the weight room into the swim, bike, run, endurance event, whatever. Okay, that translates really, really well. Typically, you're only going to do 2 to 3 sets of as many reps as you can do with great technique. So over the weeks, over the months, say you're always ending on a bird dog. Okay, when you do your bird dogs, actively count and write down how many you were able to get through. And as the weeks go by, this number should be increasing with proper form, should be increasing. And if it's not, then we need to identify what else is going on to allow you to progress. An example of some of these are suitcase carries, farmer carries, front plank and reach, TRX row with knee lift, bird dogs, polyp press, all kinds of good stuff here. Sets and reps here. This is just a quick chart. There's a couple other categories here that we talked about earlier that are not on here. But endurance, hypertrophy, strength, and power. You can see what changes as we go through the different areas, the reps, the estimated 1 rep max here, the percentage of that, sets, and rest between. Rest between is a big key here. Endurance, 1 to 2 minutes, because it's not going to be a whole lot of time because you are in fact focusing on your endurance, obviously. Hypertrophy, 2 to 5, strength, 3 to 5, and power, 3 to 6. So as the exercise gets more explosive in nature, that rest becomes more critical and more critical. And a lot of time, let's go back to the hypertrophy phase here, the phase where a lot of athletes and coaches get stuck into. A lot of times you get stuck in here because of the rest between sets, right? You can get away kind of with that 2-minute rest in between sets, but you can also get away with that 4 minutes in between sets. So it's easy to get away with this not get away with this hypertrophy phase just because it's kind of viewed as a catch-all phase, a catch-all area. So don't get stuck in this phase, and if you do, you're going to hamper your performance and your ability to utilize those muscles and actually gain strength. So how do we fit all this into our annual training plan? Okay, so changing the program every 3 to 6 weeks. Critical that you keep lifting beyond the base phase and progress through the hypertrophy and max strength phase. We talked about that earlier. Just in case you're just joining us now, if you don't keep lifting beyond those phases, you're actually opening yourself up to injury because of limiting the balance at the joints and your technique, things like that. That comes into major play as the ride, run, whatever, as your training time outside of the gym increases. That becomes very, very, very critical. So what about time? If you are a little short on time, 45, 60-minute sessions. If that's too much, there's other strategies. But foam rolling, 5 to 8 minutes. Dynamic warm-up, 5 to 8 minutes. The rest of the time, lift. That should be the rest of the time right here. You can do this twice a week and have one session just be a full-blown session, especially early on in the season. If you are someone who is really short on time, then maybe we need to think about decreasing the amount of time that you're doing an endurance session versus the amount of time you're lifting. Maybe we take away an endurance training day to add a full lifting day. And as the training time starts to increase and the demand for that time starts to increase, we could take away that lifting session and stack it on top of an endurance session, like right after or right before. And that's going to allow you to have more time, or more productive time. So just keep that in mind. Kind of breaking this down into different phases. Again, this isn't a catch-all, but this is a great place to start. Base phases. Their first base phase, picture like 3 to 5 hours a week, 2 to 4 sessions. Again, these are going to be where the sessions are a little bit longer in duration, 75 minutes each. The goal is anatomical adaptations, learning movements, addressing imbalances, or other issues that you have here. As you move into your next base phase, again, 3 to 5 hours a week, 2 to 3 sessions, and this is where we start to decrease. It's not a lot, it's just a little bit. Again, we're still focusing on that anatomical adaptation here. Base 3, if there is a base 3 for you, 3 to 5 hours a week, 2 to 3 sessions. This session is going to be 60 minutes, including your foam rolling. It's going to be where we start to really focus on the essentials of the session and start to whittle things down from there. Your build phases, you might not have 3, but if you do, the first build phase, 3 hours a week, 2 to 3 sessions, 60 minutes a week. you're going to be doing this about 2-3 times a week if you can. Focusing on the big four: hinge, pull, squat, rotary stability. Super, super important that you do. Your second build phase, we are decreasing things dramatically here: 20 to 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times a week, or 45 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. And so the first one, this is where you start stacking onto workouts if you are someone who is time dependent and you can't go beyond a physical time limitation here. That is very, very critical that you do that. About 8 to 10 weeks before your peak race, you're still building major strength, but you don't really have enough time. It's kind of going into the maintenance phase. Think like heavy kettlebells or bands at home. You're focusing on max strength here. So you're still building a little bit here, but you're not so crushing it that you're coming out of the gym feeling just dead. If you have a build 3, you're going to have 2 sessions a week, 45 to 75 minutes, full body routine. Has to involve a hinge or a pull for me, for sure. Absolutely. Again, this is only going to be if you do have time in your training phase. And if you don't, we're going to move into some of these other ones instead. Like the prep phase, 15 to 20 minutes, 4 to 6 times a week. So we're going back. Look back at that build 2. It's just decreasing just a little bit more. We're coming a little more focused in our sessions. We're going to have 1 heavy session a week. Those other ones, we're going to have 4 to 6 weeks before your race. But these all become super focused, okay? Your training stress for your lifting is going to be coming down here. In your endurance sessions, you might be approaching peak week. You might be starting to decrease some of these hours over there. So just think back to there. 2 weeks before your prep race, you're going to have 8 to 10 minute sessions, 4 to 6 times a week, but you're only going to focus on your major areas there. These sessions are not going to be super heavy. Picture these more as movement sessions for sure. If you don't, then you're definitely opening yourself up to some unneeded stress, and you're going to arrive at your A race really, really tired, really fatigued. You got to dial it back. You got to dial it back for sure. Most times you're going to have a pull, hinge, or rotary stability in here. I would argue that you need all 3 in there, but it's only going to be really 3 exercises, 2 to 3 sets, and that's it. It's going to be quick, simple, easy. We typically stack these at the end of a workout just to keep everyone happy and just to keep everyone from going into the gym as a full-blown session. It's really not a need to at this point, and you have 1,000 things that you're focusing on anyway, so you don't need to increase that other life stress there. So transition phase, 3 to 5 hours a week, 3 to 5 sessions. You definitely need a week off before starting up again. If you're doing a full, I would argue you need a little bit more time off. And dynamic warm-ups are going to be a huge part of this one, just because you want to make these sessions a little more fun. And I caution you that you don't want to jump into these too early on afterwards. You really want your athlete to have a high motivation factor in this. If this athlete is not really motivated to get back into the gym and not train a ton, then just avoid this. Avoid this until after 3, maybe even 4 weeks off. Then we need to start having a conversation. Let's get them back into the gym. Let's get them back on their bike, running, swimming, whatever their endurance event is. And you can move from there. But if you rush into this phase, it's not going to be good. So just keep that in mind. So how much time do we typically need? At the very minimum, you're going to need twice a week. I would argue triathletes need even more time just because they need more stability throughout those joints, and they need to train their body and movement awareness a little bit more. 45 to 75 minutes each might be a little bit high, but again, if you can only do 50 minutes twice a week, that's 100 extra minutes that you weren't doing last year. So just keep that in mind. 1 time a week during the middle of the season and the high time of season, it can be enough. But again, that's only going to be enough for so long before you start to see some declines in your performance. So just keep that in mind. Typically 4 to 8 weeks is all it takes, you know. This is pretty much all it takes. Triathletes for Olympic and half distance, the 3 times a week is realistic to fit into your training. And if it's not, you're probably doing a little too much training on the side. Ideal is 3 times a week. This is the optimal stimulus for your nervous system to see necessary adaptations. So just keep that in mind. You really don't want to let this slip. You don't want to let this slip at all. If you are one of those people that just has way too much time and you don't know what to do with it, you can do 4 times a week for sure. But you really need to think about your ability to absorb this training stress and if it will impact your training outside of lifting. If it's not, and you can handle it and you don't see any negative indicators, then go for it, okay? But if you don't have the amount of time, then you obviously can't do that. Different types of athletes are going to have different types of needs. The time-crunched athlete, 3 to 4 times a week of highly focused sessions are going to be your bread and butter. You could stack these sessions immediately before or after workouts. I put swim or bike here, but you can be anything. If you run at a gym, you run on a treadmill and you're right at the gym, do that lifting session right after, okay? And you're going to need limited warm-up because you're already going to be doing that because you're already going to be doing that training session, that endurance training session before. So you're going to already be warmed up. I talked about this before, but during the base phase, you might want to just totally decrease the amount of time that you are doing your endurance sessions and add a lift session in. Great strategy to use. A lot of people don't think about that because they have to hit their 4 bikes a week or they have to hit 20 miles of running a week. So just keep that in mind. The social athlete, 8 to 12 hours a week, you're going to aim for about 1 to 2 full sessions. If you cannot hit that, you might have 1 full session and then 3 additional time crunched sessions immediately after a workout. If you have the biking is life or endurance athletics is all I ever want to do and I don't want to do anything else with friends or social anything, then you're going to have a ton of time. 3 to 4 days a week of 60 to 75 minutes a piece, or you're going to do 40 to 60 minutes 2 to 4 times a week right after some of your sessions. So again, just keep in mind if you can absorb that training stress and if it is the right schedule for you. Because if you get overloaded in December and you're starting to approach burnout in December and your main race isn't until the end of July, that is a recipe for disaster. So don't overdo it and build yourself up over time. Measuring intensity. We can measure intensity in a number of different ways. Measured in total volume, amount of weight lifted in a session. It's always as a percentage of your 1 range rep max. So keep that in mind. Beginners, you might not have to go up super high. 60 to 70% of your estimated 1 rep max it might be all you need, So don't feel like you have to chase some of the traditional percentages over here, because if you are a true beginner, you don't need the true percentage of, say, of a hypertrophy phase or a max strength phase. You don't need to hit those because this is the first time you've done anything like this. 50, 60% probably will be enough for you to get those adaptations. I mean, you don't want to do any more work than you need to do to gain that adaptation. Keep that in mind for everyone. Intermediates, you're going to see a little bit more of a bump. 85 to 95% is heavy. Most athletes are going to be A-okay with 85 to 90% of their estimated 1 rep max. And we don't really need to chase beyond 90% of our estimated 1 rep max because we're not really maxing out. And if we are maxing out, then we need to take time away from that endurance aspect of our training. And we need to avoid that because, after all, that is the main focus here. 20 to 30% is going to be light movement sessions, or think like explosive movements, things like that. You measure mostly on major movements, those 6 that we talked about earlier. It becomes a little harder when you start to talk about other movements, but if you are doing body weight, you can still calculate your own body weight. So just keep that in mind as you go. And as the sets and the reps increase over time, then that volume should theoretically increase, stimulating adaptation and hopefully a strength gain. We talked about this. Strength beginners, you guys might only need 40 to 60%. That's it. If you are a true beginner, don't rush things. You will get some of these adaptations without forcing them. They will come, you just have to give them time, and you have to give your body a chance to adapt. Adjusting for fatigue, everyone will hit this point at some point in their training cycle. The first option that you can do is decreasing your weights by 5%. Right? If you do that for the first couple of sets, you say, okay, I just needed a little bit of a warm-up, then you can always go back up. But that's the best place to start, is dropping those percentages. Next is do one less set than prescribed. So if you're doing 3x15s on squats, then if you're too tired, you only do 2x15s, and then you progress through the workout. So all your other sets are going to be 2 by whatever instead of 3. Third adaptation you can do is longer rest periods. It's not ideal, but it will get you through the session, and it will allow you to see some of those gains carry over as well. The last one you can do, if none of these have helped, if you've gone down the list and it's just too much, you had too hard of a workout over the weekend, or you stacked a couple too hard workouts that were not on the plan, just turn the session into a recovery session. You're already doing it. You might as well just take the foam roller out, take the trigger point ball, and just turn it into a recovery session instead. You're going to get a lot of positive things out of that. You're going to increase the blood flow, and you're going to get a little bit looser from that as well. That's going to help big time, especially during the high times of training. On the opposite side, increasing the difficulty, you could change the sets and reps method to timed sets. So think, say you're doing 3x15 again on squat. You say, you know what, I'm just going to change that to 3x45 seconds squats. That's a great way to increase the difficulty, shortening those rest periods. But again, think about what phase you are in. Cutting too much off of that rest period is going to change the focus and change what happens as an adaptation from that workout. Tempo lifts, we just talked about that. Changing the types of load can also make it more difficult, like changing from a barbell to a dumbbell for bench press. Great example. You have to have a little bit more stability for that exercise. So that's another exercise that you can do, or another example